Hello, everybody. Right, the paper is called Adolescence, Dangers, Dilemmas and Delights. I will be talking about adolescence as a developmental process with age-appropriate developmental tasks for the transition from childhood to adulthood, and I shall illustrate some of the age-typical dangers, dilemmas and delights with clinical examples. I will begin with developmental and theoretical issues, and then I'll talk about my patient Lisa, aged 18, then David, aged 14, and finally Peggy, aged 15. And to make this easier to follow, I'm going to refer to the adolescent as he, unless specifically referring to girls. Adolescence is a normative crisis situation and a time of necessary developmental disturbance. It can be like a kind of age-appropriate transient madness in which everything is in a state of bewildering and unpredictable tension and change, and the adolescent swings from one extreme emotional position to its opposite with alarming speed. Anna Freud wrote, quotes, "Such fluctuations between extreme opposites would be deemed highly abnormal at any other time of life, but at this time they may signify no more than that an adult structure of the personality takes a long time to emerge, and that the ego of the individual in question does not cease to experiment and is in no hurry to close down on possibilities." End of quote. Winnicott described adolescence as essentially a time of personal discovery, when the mind develops the capacity to integrate the profound physical changes that start in puberty in relation to the self and to others. Throughout development, every progressive move involves giving up some source of security and pleasure in order to attain increased autonomy, mastery and achievement, and new sources of self-esteem and pleasure. An example in infancy is the weaning process, one of the first steps away from absolute dependence on the mother. Then, with the gradual separation-individuation process that reaches a peak in toddlerhood, the child begins to develop a clearer sense of the realities of the external world. The toddler has to face that he is no longer His Majesty the baby, in that his wishes conflict clearly with those of others, especially his parents. If he can deal with this blow to his narcissism and omnipotence, his ego will become stronger as he develops more mastery of his feelings and impulses. Relinquishing some of his dependence on the mother, he gains more self-reliance. This enhances his self-esteem as a somebody who can do more things for himself. The nursery school-aged child faces the developmental task of consolidating his gender identity. This involves giving up the possibility of having the attributes and capacities of the opposite gender and dealing with the envy about what he cannot have, both penis and womb. If the child can negotiate this, he gains pride and pleasure in his gender and his body. Then at the Oedipal level, he needs developmentally to give up his incestuous and rivalrous wishes towards his parents and his illusion of being big and sexually potent. This painful relinquishment involves mastery over sexual and aggressive impulses and enables the child to channel his passions into learning and developing peer relationships, the characteristics of healthy latency. All such forward moves can bring delights, but also arouse fear, anxiety, and loneliness. In pre-adolescence and puberty, the child experiences similarly exciting but also frightening, confusing, and lonely feelings. Massive hormonal and physical changes make this time even more alarming. One of the earliest developmental tasks of adolescence involves taking ownership of the sexually mature body and coming to terms with the increasing potential for adult sexuality and effective physical aggression. As his body becomes sexually mature, the adolescent has to face the idea of becoming a potentially procreative adult, with all the delights, dilemmas and dangers that go along with this. After years of childhood in which he played games and had fantasies about being grown up, like mum or dad, he is now faced with the reality that he really will soon be as big, powerful, and sexually active as his parents. The enormous sense of loss of his childhood body image and of the mother as the chief caretaker of his body can make him feel left alone with his body. He may feel desperate to find ways of experiencing his new body as gratified, loved, and approved in reality or fantasy. Previously, he could rely, in the last resort, on an adult stepping in if his behaviour got out of hand, but his increased physical strength now means that he has to take further responsibility for his actions and the damage his body could do. The biological changes in puberty arouse conflicts from earlier developmental levels and upset the balance between sexual and aggressive instinctual wishes and the defences against them, as well as between ego and superego. With his internal world in turmoil, the strains on the adolescent's ego are extreme, and he will often feel overwhelmed. His typical, desperate need not to be abnormal arouses heightened fears of humiliation, which severely test his capacity for ego mastery. Because bodily growth at puberty is uneven and uncontrollable, even the most attractive youngster will experience occasional losses of self-esteem and wounded narcissism. Real and imagined differences in the size and shapes of parts of the body, feet, nose, breasts, penis, body hair, become distorted and magnified, causing the adolescent to feel extremely self-conscious and terrified of exposure. Girls may wear baggy tops to disguise their breasts, fearing that they are too big or too small. And they may be constantly on guard against mortifying spots of menstrual blood until their periods become more regular and expectable. Boys may become anxious that they will have a spontaneous erection in public, especially in the shower after sports, or if asked to stand up in front of others in class. Conversely, some teenagers may make a point of emphasizing their sexual characteristics, sometimes to seek reassurance that their sexual body is normal and acceptable, and sometimes to celebrate their emerging sexuality. Their body now being wholly theirs, they will experiment with such things as body piercing, sometimes as a defiance of parental authority. Another developmental task of adolescence involves reworking unresolved conflicts from earlier developmental levels in childhood. Ernest Jones wrote, quotes, "The individual recapitulates and expands the development he passed through during the first 5 years, and the precise way in which a given person will pass through the necessary stages of development in adolescence is to a very large extent determined by the form of his infantile development." Close quote. The capacity to make use of a progressive pull is essential at any developmental phase to outweigh the regressive wish to remain at the current level. But in a healthy adolescent process, some regression is essential for reworking earlier levels of development so as to resolve the infantile conflicts and move on. Bloss wrote, quotes, "Adolescence is the only period in human life in which regression constitutes an obligatory component of normal development. Adolescent regression operates, therefore, in the service of development. And progressive development is precluded if regression does not take its proper course at the proper time within the sequential pattern of the adolescent process." Close quotes. To determine the balance between progression and regression, and between health and pathology, one needs to know about the adolescent's background, home environment and development throughout infancy and childhood, and assess the extent to which the young person's behaviour is an expression of the adolescent developmental process itself, and whether or not he is actively engaged in the developmental tasks of adolescence. Regression to earlier levels of relating is expectable in the face of the intense confusion and anxiety about growing up. Acquiring an adult body powerfully reminds the girl that she is like, yet separate from, her mother. Her struggle with the regressive pull to the mother may be displaced onto homosexual crushes or defended against by promiscuous heterosexuality. For the boy, the biological changes challenge his sense of masculinity as his regressive passive longings conflict with active male identifications. The most typical example of the adolescent's swing between regressive and progressive forces can be seen in the way he relates to adults, especially parents. At one moment he will resent being treated like a child and will angrily insist that he can look after himself and should be allowed complete freedom. At another moment, he will resent being given this freedom and responsibility and will want to be attended to like a younger child. This leads us to another developmental task, namely giving up the lifelong dependence on the parents and moving towards emotional independence. Separating and individuating involves many dilemmas and dangers. The adolescent typically struggles with the conflict of wanting to become an independent adult, which he finds delightfully exciting and liberating, but also fears, but wishing as well to be looked after like a dependent child, regressive longings which he also dreads and defends against. He swings from needy dependence to rebellious independence and rejection of the parents. He both fears and longs for intimacy. Alongside this, he struggles to find an identity that will make him feel good about himself, and his sense of loneliness increases. As the adolescent begins to loosen his childhood dependence on his parents, he has to give up his reliance on their support and rely on his own internal resources. His defences may crumble, and his capacity to function and deal with reality may be impaired. In severe cases, the adolescent will break down. The material to follow describes a late adolescent who had experienced an adolescent breakdown. And I want to introduce how we might see what lies behind the presenting picture of contempt, provocation and defiance in this case example. At 18, Lisa had a breakdown at university, chiefly due to an inability to cope with the separation from her parents, and she returned home to London. Her sadomasochistic style of relating had caused her to lose friends and boyfriends, yet Lisa revelled in describing herself as tough and provocative and a prize bitch. This brittle facade was an attempt to defend against conflicts over aggression, regression, dependence and passivity, and a means of trying to find some kind of self-image to defy her sadistic superego that demanded she should be perfect. With such a harsh superego, she had no way of feeling good about herself, and could only find temporary means to raise her self-esteem by rebelling and giving free rein to her aggressive impulses, both towards others and herself. She got into physical fights with boyfriends, drank and smoked marijuana to excess, and constantly put herself at risk. Consciously desperate for help, she started 5 times weekly analysis, but for many months she could not allow herself to engage with me or recognise any feelings of attachment to me. Over time, I began to understand that she was terrified that if I became important to her, she would be vulnerable to losing me, and then face unbearable despair and isolation. She often came to sessions 30 minutes late, or not at all, and was very contemptuous of me. She announced, "Analysis is pointless anyway, because I'm too crazy. Even 100 Sigmund Freuds would never figure me out." I took up her despair that she was irreparably damaged and mad, and spoke of her disappointment at being stuck with an ordinary analyst, and not a celebrated ideal. If she could not be perfect, she felt worthless. And if I wasn't Freud, I was useless. I did not interpret her contempt of me at this stage, sensing that she would perceive such an interpretation as a retaliatory attack, and incorporate it into her defensively sadomasochistic need to provoke a battle between us. Instead, by acknowledging her sense of being deprived of the best, I hoped that she might perceive that I did not only see the vindictive child in her, but the needy one as well. I had to struggle, though, with my resentment and wish to retaliate, but it helped when I could understand her behaviour as a passive into active defence against feeling useless, unwanted, and dropped. I interpreted her provocations in terms of a wish to see if I could survive the attacks without rejecting her, as a wish to engage me in an exciting battle to ward off feelings of futility and emptiness, and as a way of keeping control over the analysis for fear of being helplessly dependent on me. I understood her entrenched sadomasochistic style of relating as a defence against what Glasser calls core complex anxieties of abandonment and engulfment, whereby she could maintain a safe distance yet also a hold on the object. Her defiance was not part of the adolescent process of individuation, but represented her inability to face separateness and reflected an internal sadomasochistic battle between a punitive superego that demanded perfection and her needy and aggressive infantile wishes. It took many months before she could tell me, "I'm a past master at hurting. I know how to spin out someone's agony and torment them. When they reach the danger zone, that's when I know they like me and will be hurt. It's a test to see if they like me enough to stick around. If I feel depressed, I have to fight. It's the only way I know of relating to people and finding out if they care or not. Fighting and provoking are my best talents. I'm not good at anything else." There are many reasons why an adolescent might be unable to detach in a healthy way from the parents. He may be terrified of abandonment and loss, perhaps due to earlier traumatic experiences, or his struggles to individuate may be entangled with his parents' own conflicts about separation. He may lack a sufficiently strong sense of self in the absence of a positive attachment to his parents, or he may have an unresolved ambivalence and aggression towards them. Like Lisa, he may try to separate himself geographically, deny any attachment, or attempt to reverse his feelings of need into hostile, defiant independence. Aggression, which in a healthy adolescent is used to facilitate the necessary separation from parents, may instead be directed against the self, leading to depression, self-harm, such as abuse of alcohol or drugs, promiscuity, eating disorders, self-mutilation, and sometimes suicide. Another developmental task facing the adolescent is the establishment of a mature sexual organisation. In addition to coping with huge instinctual pressures and adjusting to a new body image, young adolescents also have to readjust to their sense of masculinity or femininity. In the course of reworking early childhood conflicts, many young people experience homosexual feelings. These sometimes represent unresolved longings for a merged, exclusively dependent relationship. But they may also reflect the search for an identity based on the wish to emulate something wonderful in another person of the same sex. This is partly due to the adolescent's confusion about who he is and will become, but also to the heightened narcissism of the adolescent, whereby idealization of self and of the ideal other is intense. The adolescent is a bundle of fantasies of possibilities. There is delight in this, but also confusion. Masturbation may offer a way for the adolescent to take possession of his newly matured sexual body and begin to integrate adult sexuality with a sense of a masculine or feminine identity. The adolescent needs to find ways of gratifying his sexual urges and overcoming his conflicts about intimacy, so that he has sufficient instinctual and emotional freedom to form adult sexual relationships. This involves making mature identifications with parents as a sexually active couple, and coming to terms with identifications or disidentifications with the same-sex parent. Incestuous wishes have to be repressed, whilst these crucial identifications are being made, and new relationships must be found for satisfying sexual and dependent needs. The ability to have a number of infatuations without being too damaged by the inevitable disappointments and rejections is a sign of ego strength and resilience. Adolescents who cannot negotiate all these dilemmas may attempt to leapfrog over them into a premature foreclosure of adolescent sexual development. Another developmental task concerns developing an identity and an individual conscience. The developmental task of detachment and individuation involves letting go of the images of the parents as authority figures and integrating internal authority in the form of a mature, autonomous superego. Freud wrote, quotes, "One of the most significant but also one of the most painful psychical achievements of the pubertal period is detachment from parental authority." Close quotes. De-idealization of the parents of childhood, although liberating, is a very distressing aspect of growing up because of the sense of emptiness and loneliness it can bring. This is similar to mourning. The objects of the past must be given up to leave the adolescent free to find new love objects. The importance of belonging to the peer group and the search for an ideal self, represented externally by admired hero figures and passionate idealism about certain causes and activities, take on a more powerful influence than that of the parents. During puberty and early adolescence, intellectual capacities such as abstract and logical thinking develop, and, together with the changing relationship to the parents, bring increased awareness of and questioning about moral and political issues. Typical passions concern matters of world importance that the adolescent believes are being insufficiently attended to by the adult world, such as world peace, racism, animal rights. Such ideals provide a focus for directing his passions and his aggression in a very adaptive and socially useful way, whilst at the same time allowing him to feel superior to his parents as he forms a differentiated identity. Narcissistic balance is disturbed alarmingly in adolescence, causing the youngster to be self-absorbed and preoccupied. He struggles to feel real and experiments with different fantasy versions of himself until finally he adjusts to a more realistic view about his limitations and capabilities and place in the world. Typically, adolescent narcissistic processes become in some vulnerable young people even more prominent. They may defensively create a fantasy world, a sort of narcissistic retreat, in which they reign as omnipotent, grandiose figures in order to escape from fears of inadequacy, confusion, loneliness, and depression. Such adolescents may engage in dangerous and compulsive behaviour and then expose themselves to risk from their own or others' sexual and aggressive impulses. The following material describes a traumatised and narcissistically vulnerable adolescent who defensively needed to protect himself from acknowledging that he was in need of help. His age-typical dread of regression and intimacy was especially intense, and his story illustrates Winnicott's thesis that at the root of the antisocial tendency there is always deprivation. David, age 14, was referred because of disruptive and sexualised behaviour. He grabbed girls in a sexually aggressive way and said that he wanted to be a rapist when he grew up. He bullied boys at school and was rude, aggressive and out of control. His background of extreme neglect and violence included not having enough to eat and a home like a slum, with rats and rubbish everywhere and no usable toilet or bath. David sometimes witnessed his father hitting his mum when she was having an epileptic fit. And the dad was also violent to his 4 sons, especially to David. Father watched pornographic videos with David, and it is likely that David also witnessed parental sex. Because of the unacceptable home environment, the children were all taken into care. The parents then separated, and neither of them contacted the children after this. David's 3 younger brothers were all adopted, but David refused to be, still hoping to return to his mother one day, even though she had shown absolutely no interest in him. After several failed placements because of very disturbed behaviour, David eventually settled with a foster family whose children were in their early 20s. In our first meeting, David made it clear that he didn't want therapy and that the long journey to the clinic was boring and too tiring. At first he said he didn't know why he was here, but then he said it was because he'd been pinching girls' bottoms at school. But he'd been told off, was all in the past, hadn't happened again. I said many people felt like he did about therapy because they weren't sure what it was all about and thought it was a sort of punishment. But actually therapy was really to help people understand themselves, begin to sort things out and hopefully like themselves better so that their life in the future could be happier. David remained hunched up in the chair looking very bored. So I suggested quite light-heartedly that maybe he thought I was talking a load of tosh. He looked a bit surprised and said hesitantly, as if he wanted to be polite but also honest, that perhaps I was right, that I was talking tosh. When I asked how he felt about himself, he said he was quite happy now that he got a job on a farm after school and at weekends. He was still trying to convey that he needed no help. So I had to try to find a way to help him with his defences against shame and the fear of facing his difficulties. I showed great interest in his job and asked him to tell me about it. As if relieved that he could talk about things that he knew about and could do well, he started to speak very enthusiastically about the cows on the farm and how he had to milk them and care for them. I said that I could see he was very attached to the animals and he had a lot of skill in the way he treated them. He began to relax and seemed less wary of me. The way he then described how you should approach a strange, frightened animal indicated very movingly how I should relate to him. He said, "You should never make a big fuss or a lot of noise around an animal if it doesn't know you, but you should approach it very slowly and gently and let it get to know you gradually until it feels safe. It might be scared of you at first, but then it will become very attached to you." I asked a lot about the animals and how he managed them, and he grinned with pleasure when I admired his enthusiasm and skill. He was surprised when the session came to an end. In the ensuing once-weekly sessions, David talked more about the farm animals and about his skill in driving and mending the tractors. This conveyed his capacity for tenderness and reparation, as well as pride in his phallic skills. My appreciative listening helped him to begin to value himself more as someone who wasn't only just trouble, and to risk being curious about himself and his difficulties. He began to take more responsibility for his feelings and actions, and the bullying and sexualized behaviour stopped. By the end of therapy, when he started at agricultural college, he seemed to have begun to face the major developmental tasks of adolescence. He had a more solid view of himself, a positive attitude towards his future, and a better capacity to stand up for himself without being exploited or resorting to physical aggression. He could think more about himself and his impact on others. He'd found a girlfriend and he'd finally been able to give up his vain hope that his mother would come lovingly one day to claim him. David had made some progress in developing a more responsible and positive identity, and could consider a future for himself as an adult, with more realistic prospects of work and adult relationships. And this brings us to the final developmental task of moving into the world of adulthood. If the earlier developmental tasks of the adolescent process can be negotiated, the late adolescent can now begin to face thinking of taking responsibility for making a life for himself. He begins to have ideas for his future, based on a more realistic view of himself. He thinks about what job he might like, and what he needs to do to get it. He begins to have ideas about adult sexual relationships, about what kind of partner he'd like, and about maybe becoming a parent one day. Most young people, as they progress through adolescence, manage to negotiate the various internal and external dangers and dilemmas. They feel safe enough to risk defeat and frustration, to tolerate their inadequacies and those of others, and to enjoy the delights and excitement of experimenting without getting into too much danger. But there are other youngsters who arrive at adolescence with vulnerabilities and unresolved conflicts left over from early developmental levels, and with an insufficiently strong ego or secure sense of self. These are the ones who are unable to engage with the developmental tasks of the adolescent process and are in need of help. I will end by telling you about one such adolescent, Peggy, who was in treatment with me between the ages of 15 to 18. Just before Peggy was 3 years old, she was identified as at risk and referred to a therapeutic nursery. She was the only child of vulnerable and disturbed parents, both alcoholic and both with mental health problems. As Peggy grew into an intelligent, delightful but demanding toddler, the relationship between the parents deteriorated. She witnessed many parental fights and was often caught in the crossfire. Her mother, who had been raised in care, was needy and often depressed. She took refuge in alcohol and medication, withdrew into sleep, and made many suicide attempts. The slightest sign of criticism or rejection sparked off explosions of narcissistic rage when she lost control and said terrible things which she later bitterly regretted, such as telling Peggy, "You're evil, an omen, you can't be my child, they must have swapped you at birth." Then, feeling remorseful about failing to be a good mum, she would then become even more depressed and sensitive to criticism, which could trigger further violent episodes. Her verbal and physical fights with Peggy and the neighbours often led to police intervention. Her husband left her when Peggy was nearly 4. Overwhelmed with rage, she was quite unable to help Peggy mourn the loss of her father, even refusing to allow Peggy to mention his name. At the age of 4.5, Peggy had a year of analysis. This helped her through a particularly difficult time and enabled her to talk about the loss of her dad. She settled at primary school, and analysis was terminated gradually when the therapist left the country. But the clinic continued its support of her mother. When Peggy was 11 years old, her mother referred her for therapy again because Peggy was withdrawn and depressed and had difficulties with friends. Peggy was seen once a week by a second therapist, but she didn't attend for very long. The next crisis came when her mother filed for divorce on Peggy's 14th birthday. This was a surprise, because both mother and Peggy had always said that they hoped Dad might return one day. Peggy's unresolved Oedipal loss and guilt about his abandonment of her and her mum resurfaced. Peggy started shoplifting and truanting from school. She returned to therapy, but her therapist, second therapist, was also soon due to leave the clinic. Mother's vengeful rage towards her husband led to more stormy scenes, and after a particularly explosive row, Peggy ran off to stay with her dad for a few weeks. Her school attendance got worse, and finally she dropped out of school altogether. It was at this point, soon after her 15th birthday, that I first saw Peggy and offered her a 3 times weekly vacancy. My first impression was of a politely shy and compliant girl who looked a lot younger than 15. As we thought about her school refusal, it became clear that she had huge conflicts over dependence and separation, that she was terrified about growing up and becoming like her mum, and that she regressed to passivity in the face of intense rage towards both parents. She feared that her anger would destroy her parents or make them abandon her. And she brought the fantasy that by not going to school, she could somehow magically prolong her childhood and possibly reunite her parents. After 5 months of therapy, Peggy did manage to return to school and maintained regular attendance, helped by a supportive teacher in a special unit for pupils with special needs. During therapy, Peggy described dreams of vampires that drained her blood, and through her drawings and daydreams, she withdrew into a fantasy world where everything was in her control. Describing a fantasy of putting people she hated into a spiked barrel, she was very careful to exclude her parents from the list of victims, fearful of her murderous rage, even in fantasy. Her hatred for them was turned into self-loathing and fantasies of self-destruction. She assumed the blame not only for the breakup of the marriage and for her father's desertion, but also for her mother's unstable mental state. I took up Peggy's self-directed anger in various ways, but especially in relation to her death wishes towards her mother, since suicide seems to represent the murder of that part of her that was identified with her mother. In a desperate attempt to avoid growing up to be like her mum, Peggy resisted every sign of adolescent development. She was scornful of peers who were interested in boys, and she shunned all ideas of marriage or motherhood. She defensively expressed the wish to be a boy and to have a penis, a symbol for everything, including her father, that she had been deprived of, as well as an extreme attempt at disidentifying from her mum. Peggy was often furious with her dad and consistently denied any longing for him. But things changed when she discovered, when she was 16, that he had a girlfriend. Soon after this, she suddenly announced that she had gone to bed and had sex with a man of her father's age. Although this turned out to be a fantasy, it was her first acknowledgement of sexual interest, and she was soon able to recognise that she wanted this man to be the loving father she yearned for. It was now possible to address more directly her search for her lost father, as well as her conflicts about sexuality and feminine identification. Peggy began to act out by lying to her parents, keeping secrets from me, and getting involved with a delinquent boy of her own age. She flirted with the idea of getting pregnant, and sometimes ran away from home, as if trying to force herself to individuate from her parents, but also wanting them to run after her, claim her, and care for her as a little girl. She would often sit in an angry, stubborn silence in therapy, with her chair turned away from me. I suggested, maybe the only way you can feel more grown up and independent is by wanting to hurt yourself, your parents and me, because you're so angry and feel so unloved and can't value yourself enough to take care of yourself. I addressed her need to elicit the concern of her parents and me in the transference, her wish to spite us for not providing enough loving protection, her fear that I would desert her like Dad and her previous therapists, and her fear that her anger really could destroy people. Over time, this understanding seemed to help, and she gradually became more communicative in sessions. But she became obsessed with black magic and torture. She dreamed of Mother as a witch, and she brought fantasies of murdering or being murdered by her mother. She now openly expressed death wishes about both parents, but became anxious about explosions, death, and eating meat, and she feared that she was going mad. The anxiety mobilized by these conflicts over murderous wishes led to many bodily symptoms and fears. She suffered prolonged headaches. There was a brief recurrence of her infantile eczema. She couldn't sleep, and she feared that she had cancer. Her worst fear was that she would get appendicitis and wake in agony during surgery. This fantasy condensed many of her conflicts over aggression and anxieties about body damage, sexual intercourse, and childbirth, and it symbolised her feelings of lack of safety, helplessness, and despair, both in the past and in the present. It also represented a need to be punished for sexual and aggressive wishes, and a frightening identification with her mother, who had suffered much pain and nearly died because of a stomach ulcer some years before. Peggy's depression increased as we worked on the roots of these conflicts, but she was now better able to think about herself and her feelings in therapy. She brought many lonely, sad and confused memories of childhood, such as when her mum was unavailable because mum was drunk, drugged, depressed or asleep. Material about loss and separation had taken centre stage, and one could see how her hatred and aggression had served in part to defend against the helplessness of feeling alone and terrified with no one to protect or care for her. She described how her home wasn't alive after her dad had left, but she could also recall happier times with both parents and spoke of her magical time at nursery school. It was as if she felt all the good things had been taken away, but now, instead of only feeling deprived and persecuted, a mourning process had become possible. She began to express sadness and sympathy for her mother's disturbed mental state, and could recognise the effects of her mother's unhappy history, as well as mother's brave attempts to do her best to be a good mum, for example by seeing that Peggy had therapy. Gradually she began to realise and could sometimes aspire to identify with the positive aspects of her parents, such as their intellectual and artistic interests. Peggy's story highlights many aspects of the adolescent process, which for her, sadly, brought only terrifying dangers and impossible dilemmas, no delights. It showed her inability to address the developmental tasks of adolescence. Intensely and ambivalently tied to her parents, she was completely unable to separate or even differentiate herself from them, especially mother. Her conflict about growing up represented her fear of having to separate from her mother, as well as her fear of not being able to differentiate from her, of getting trapped in mum's frightening, hostile world, and of being similarly rejected and abandoned by men. Loosening the tie to mother was made even more difficult because of mother's pathology, and mother's reliance on Peggy as a kind of substitute husband and mother to protect and care for her. Peggy had little chance of simply being a child. Faced with the actual loss of her father during the height of the Oedipal phase, Peggy had no real basis for competition with her mother, and no incentive to relinquish her pre-Oedipal attachment. Feeling rejected by her father was destructive to her self-esteem. Without a present, participating father, her normal phallic narcissistic and Oedipal development, feminine identifications and superego development were all damaged. Peggy remained stuck at an infantile level of relating. In terms of ego development, her defences against aggression and feelings of loneliness and lack of safety were entrenched. She dealt with painful reality by avoidance and by seeking refuge in fantasy. Her stealing and school refusal, largely aimed at eliciting the concern of the parents and teachers, illustrated the incapacity of her ego to cope with aggressive urges, heightened by intense infantile conflicts reawakened by the onset of adolescence and the divorce. Her superego was primitive and punitive, leaving her with no reliable sources for regulating self-esteem. She could not accept her new body image or her developing sexuality. She shunned all interest in boys and her appearance. She had no sense of femininity, wished instead to be a boy, and was light years away from being able to establish a mature sexual organisation. She had no sense of an identity of her own, and was too terrified of growing up to have any hopeful thoughts for her future as an adult. The major tasks of therapy, therefore, were to address Peggy's conflicts over aggression and femininity, and to foster her differentiation from her mother and her capacity to mourn the loss of her father, so as to pave the way for the healthy adolescent processes of separation, individuation, and mourning. Due to the enormous pressures and emotional turmoil of adolescence, young people can be very difficult to work with in therapy. They may be withdrawn, unreachable, apathetic, secretive, dismissive, bolshy, contemptuous. But their passionate idealism, their excitement about discovering the world of adult sexuality, and their irreverence and debunking of adult pomposity and correctness can be very refreshing. Despite all the challenges that face the therapist, it can be a very moving, stimulating, and often rewarding experience to accompany the adolescent on his quest for himself. Thank you.